Unemployment is picking up all over the world. Now, it isn't skyrocketing, but it is getting noticeably higher in a lot of places maybe you wouldn't think of because all we hear is strong and resilient economies everywhere. Maybe in places like Europe, they might say, well, the economy has stagnated. But unemployment rates are creeping up in Germany, France, Sweden, the UK, Japan, even Canada, and of course, the United States. As more and more people realize that unemployment rates are rising, what you'll hear is that, well, that's okay. This is what we planned on happening. Because after all, as we all know, the US economy and the global economy was red hot in 2021 and to an extent in 2022. And so the unemployment rate needs to rise and the level of unemployment needs to go up in order for the economy to normalize. Yet while central bankers will tell us that they're okay with unemployment rising, their rate cuts and their increasing pivots to rate cuts suggest that they're a little bit more anxious about this than they would have you otherwise understand. Steve Van Meter, did you realize, for example, that the unemployment rate in Canada, red hot Canada, inflationary Canada, has risen by 1.2 points in just the last year? According to the government estimates in Canada, the unemployment rate as of May of this year was 6.2%. That's up from 5.0% in April of 2023. Maybe that's why the Bank of Canada has decided we're not as threatened by inflation anymore.
Jeff, that would be a really good reason not to be threatened by inflation. In fact, if we saw the U.S. unemployment rate at 6%, I would be willing to bet the Fed would be talking about cutting rates too. And that's what really makes this interesting because, we had this supply shock and the solution was, well, we need to restrict demand. And you're right. Central bankers all around the world said, hey, you know what? We're okay with some people losing their jobs as long as it's not us. And that was a key point because they don't want to be out of work at any point ever, as long as they can keep people believing in the mystique of central banking. The problem I have, Jeff, is these central bankers think that, okay, we're going to move policy into a restrictive zone and that's fine. We'll see some people lose their jobs. Inflation will come down, but if we'll just pull back the lever just a little bit, maybe a cut or two, and who knows, maybe even if we have to go about 3, and next thing you know, those people are going to be back at work. The economy is going to be booming. I have a hunch that that's just not the direction it goes.
Yeah, that's always the conceit, isn't it? The idea that, okay, we're the reason why unemployment's rising to begin with, and we're the reason why consumer prices are coming down with our restrictive monetary policies. They're really interest rate policies, not monetary policies. And so if we start to see things getting out of control, we'll just reverse course, apply some precautionary rate cuts, and everything will just smooth out nice and easy, just like everyone wants. But that again assumes that the Fed is the reason for this to begin with, or that the ECB is the reason for this to begin with. But we have to keep in mind that consumer prices are not national. Every single central bank was raising rates because consumer prices globally and globally synchronized fashion increased a couple years ago. And now we're seeing that global prices are coming down and global unemployment is beginning to rise. It's not a matter of the ECB cutting rates for Europe because Europe is in the same boat as everyone else. And I think that's really the overriding point that a lot of people are missing is that as unemployment is rising globally, it's a reflection of globally coordinated and synchronized factors. And we see this not just in places like Canada, but also the United States. I mean, the US unemployment rate is up to 4%. It was as low as 3.4% last year. And that doesn't sound like much. And that's what makes it, as you were just saying, it makes it easy to downplay it. Okay, it's only to 4%. What's the big deal? But the fact is that it has risen 0.6 of a percentage point since last year already puts it into recession territory. It's not how low it is, it's the direction it's going and how long it's going in that same direction.
Yeah, Jeff, because the reason Bank of Canada can get away with this, and a lot of people will say, well, wait a minute, doesn't that mean their currency is going to go down in value? Well, that's just how the market tends to play rate cuts. So you think about it in a booming economy, obviously, So you don't want to have opposing central bank policies, because if you do have demand in your economy and your currency weakens, then you're likely to get inflation. But this is actually a smart play by the Bank of Canada to say, hey, wait a minute, it doesn't matter if the market sells off our currency, it loses value. Our economy is weakening here, so we need to cut rates. Now, we could argue all day long that the rate cuts won't make any difference. But one thing I think is interesting here is we know the Fed follows, say, 2-year Treasury yields. But if someone didn't really want to follow that, if you looked at like continued unemployment claims and then you overlaid the federal funds rate, you would find out really something more interesting is that central bankers talk about lots of worthless things like inflation and whatever. But in the end of the day, the moment too many people start losing their jobs, they panic and cut rates. But notably, it never works, Jeff. Never one time does any central bank cutting rates put a halt. In fact, it tends to accelerate the number of people on unemployment. And so that's what makes this interesting to me. Bank of Canada's move pretty much right on target of where they need to be.
It isn't just Canada, of course. We're talking about the European Central Bank, which cut rates last month or earlier this month, even though consumer prices aren't down where they said consumer prices needed to be in order for them to even think about cutting rates. Not only that, some of the data that they've prioritized, such as wages and salaries and everything else, that accelerated in the first quarter of this year, and yet they cut rates anyway. First of all, we know for really solid reasons that there isn't any relationship. There is no Phillips curve. There's no relationship between consumer prices and unemployment to begin with. Nor is there one, like Steve was just saying, there's no relationship between interest rate policies by central banks and any macroeconomic variables either. So why go through with this type of behavior? Why even bother cutting rates at all? It raises a bunch of questions, especially, sticking with Europe. Look at unemployment. The unemployment rate in Germany just ticked up to 6.0%, which is the highest in 2 years, going back to May of 2021, at least according to the Federal Employment Agency over there. France, where they're undertaking a contentious election this coming weekend. In fact, it's happening as we're talking about here. The French unemployment rate just moved up to 7.5% for the first quarter of 2024. And it's been at that level for 3 quarters in a row after being down to 7.1% at the start of last year. The one odd person out in the European situation is Italy. Got to give credit to Italy. Italy's unemployment rate is actually going the opposite way. It's actually going down and pretty sharply. And as of April, it's at the lowest since 2008. But you look across Europe, unemployment is rising in most of the economies, especially the big economies, Italy being the exception. And suddenly the ECB is saying, what inflation? Let's start cutting rates here.
The reality is they don't really care if inflation is going up, because if people are losing their jobs, that's really the issue here. And maybe all the political uncertainty around the world is starting to brew by the fact that there are people out of work and they don't see the prospect of getting another job.
It's interesting you brought up the correlation or the lack of correlation between interest rate policies and actual economic variables like consumer price changes or even GDP or something like that. When you actually put together the data and run, regression analysis, just to find simple correlations, what you do find is that there are very strong correlations in consumer prices across different economies, or what's supposed to be different economies across the world. For example, the US CPI is highly correlated with the European HICP. It's actually very correlated with countries like Mexico and Canada. So if we see the European economy or the Mexican economy start to soften, that doesn't just mean that consumer prices will become disinflationary. It's very likely that the conditions that are leading to those outcomes in those places are going to be impacting the US economy too. So if we're seeing, for example, rising unemployment in places like Sweden, where the unemployment rate just hit 8.3%. That's up from 7.1% in 2022. So you say, well, who cares about unemployment in Sweden besides the poor Swedes who are thrown out of work? Well, if Sweden's experiencing unemployment, and France is experiencing unemployment, and Germany's experiencing unemployment, and Canada's experiencing unemployment, that means there's a globally synchronized wave of unemployment building that is going to impact the United States. And like we keep saying, it already has. We're getting symptoms of that all across not just the consumer economy, but all sorts of economic variables. So it's not just that the US is experiencing a little bit of a come down from its red hot performance. We continue to see unemployment building all across the world. At the same time, disinflation is coming on. And central bankers are getting increasingly nervous that, even if that it might actually get out of control. And so that's why they're trying to cut rates in anticipation of the possibility that this may not actually be something they can just smooth out with one or two.
Yeah, that's right, Jeff, because what you're suggesting here is that we are indeed a globally synchronized economy, but we're not in perfect harmony. So what happens in one part of the world doesn't instantaneously happen somewhere else. It kind of happens kind of like a wave where it slowly moves across different countries and continents into different economies. And so that's exactly what's happening here, because if you have someone in Sweden or France or Germany who's out of work, well, their consumption is going to go down. And being a global economy, of course, that means there's U.S. imported goods that are going to go there, demand for U.S. services that from other countries. And so as demand around the world starts to soften and go away, it does indeed impact the United States. Despite the fact that, well, many people think we're an island of our own. We're synchronized when we need to be, but not when we don't want to be. But it doesn't work that way. In fact, what we're just starting to see here, and something we've talked about, is that continued unemployment claims have been hovering around 1.8 million. And now they're taking up around 10, 15,000 a week and up to 1.84. And while we could sit back and say that's not really substantial in terms of the overall U.S. labor market, what's notable here is if you look at continued unemployment claims against initial claims, if you don't see continued claims start to come down at some point, initial claims start to go up. And that's where it starts to get dangerous, is it starts to spiral out of control, where more people show up on unemployment and there's a lack of jobs because other people are in the process of losing their jobs. So is the U.S. immune to all this? Absolutely not. It's just a matter of time when the lag hits ours.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most confounding aspects of this cycle so far is the length of time, which makes it easier to dismiss all of these signals. Because you can say, well, I don't see unemployment rising quickly like we would in any type of familiar recession pattern. So if the French unemployment rate goes up 0.4% over a couple different quarters, that doesn't sound like a big deal. But it builds up on you. It sneaks up on you, right? I mean, you think about Canada. Canada's unemployment rate, before you know it, it's above 6%. And it's risen an entire point plus in over a year. But it doesn't necessarily look like the familiar recession where it seems like everything just happens all at once. But again, you keep coming back to the point where it's not just one place or another. It's in all of these different places, with the exception of Italy, but all over Europe, even Japan. Japan is experiencing what we might consider something like that for the Japanese economy, which, unemployment and employment is always at maximums in Japan anyway. And unemployment is actually always pretty low to begin with. But over the last couple years here, going back, the current unemployment rate in Japan is 2.6% as of May. And it's been 2.6% for 4 straight months. And of course, you say 2.6%, that's incredibly low. But it actually changed. It actually stopped falling at 2.4% early last year. So the Japanese unemployment rate to sort of hover and slightly increase for over a year, that's the same as Canada's unemployment rate increasing by a full percentage point in the same period of time. But that's the issue here. You see this all across the world. Ever since the early part of last year, and the US is included in this discussion too, ever since the early part of last year, unemployment rates and unemployment has been creeping higher and higher and higher. And we're just now seeing not just the effects of it, but we're also seeing how much more visible those effects are. It has been coming on all of this time. Meanwhile, everybody from central bankers to the mainstream media said, don't worry about any of this. It's not a big issue. The economies are strong and resilient. At the same time, unemployment rate continues to build. Unemployment continues to build and build and build all over the global economy.
Yeah, and what's interesting, Jeff, is it starts slowly at first and then it accelerates. And just kind of, what I like to tell people is boots on the ground. Just go out to the places you normally go and during the times you normally happen to be there and look around and see what you see and talk to the people that work there and ask questions. Are people spending as much? Are they doing as much? And what I've noticed recently is everybody starting to complain and say, hey, things are hitting a wall. Sales all of a sudden dropped off. People aren't showing up as much. Those who do, they're not spending as much. Some people are just window shopping. I mean, all of a sudden, things like tips are down, restaurant workers. And Jeff, this is like one of the busiest times of the year, particularly where I live, where people just show up and throw money around like crazy. And yet they're not coming in droves like they used to. And so what we're seeing is just a symptom of the economy. Again, starts out kind of slow. And then next thing you know, everyone's looking around. Maybe I have a job and I look and it's like, man, Jeff just got his hours cut or he just got fired. Boy, what if I'm next? So that starts to feed into, of course, people's thinking. And what did we see today in the PCE data? That the savings rate is headed back up. Well, and it's almost a shock to the people writing the articles. It's not a shock. Because when things slow down and people start losing their jobs and get their hours cut, they start saving money because they're afraid they're next. And when that happens, of course, as we know, at least even less consumption. And as that occurs, you get more people on unemployment. The question maybe remains is, Fed Chair Powell says the peak of unemployment in the U.S. was 4%. I had to laugh when he said that, Jeff, because I don't think that's the case at all.
Yeah, and I think that's what this review of global unemployment is actually telling us, that we think that it should be a peak at a relatively easy low level, and 4% coming up from 3.4% really isn't that high of a level. But it's not the level, it's the direction. And it's really difficult to say that it's going to stop right here, right where we want it to, when we see unemployment continue to rise everywhere else. That's really the point we're making here, is that yes, Jay Powell would like the unemployment rate to stop right where it is right now, thinking that the second half is going to be really good. And that's going to be the end of all of these questions about soft landing or any landing. The soft landing is going to show up in the second half of this year, when the unemployment rate is going to plateau and level off right at 4%, and everyone will be absolutely happy. And if he has to, maybe a rate cut or two, just to ensure that, just to raise the chances to almost 100% that takes place. When in reality, it doesn't work like that. And we all know, just what you said, that unemployment tends to start out relatively slow, and then at some point it might accelerate. But even if it doesn't, that doesn't matter. It's impossible to say where it'll stop. Even if it continues on the low trajectory where it's not really building up all that fast, the fact that we're already at 4%, or that Canada's already at 6%, or Sweden's already at 8%, and it continues to rise, given the conditions that we've just experienced, where consumer prices went way ahead, and now you throw some substantial and sustained unemployment on top of all that, that is the recipe for, first of all, really angry voters, as we're kind of getting the sense in 2024. But more than that, it's a recipe for economic disaster. You can't impoverish everybody and then start taking jobs away and not think this is going to end up all really easy to fix with just one or two rate cuts.
Yeah, Jeff, and you wonder why central bankers are starting to, look at cutting rates and those that have already. It's really simple. We were supposed to have a soft landing. We were supposed to have a second half rebound. We should be seeing the global economy accelerating from here. And what did we actually find out? That it's actually taking another leg down. This is not what they told us was going to happen. As you said, you're starting to see this political unrest because people are just not happy with being unable to keep up with inflation. And then even worse, finding out that maybe they don't have a job. Of course, this means, as we know, the Fed and other central bankers, they're not going to do one or two cuts. They're going to do a whole lot more, and a lot sooner than they think.
And they'll do it because there is no recession, right, Steve? I mean, that's what we continue to hear, that there is no recession. We just have all of the features of a recession, just nobody says there is a recession, including when the Fed starts to turn around, cut rates. That will be the last piece of the recession puzzle. We got unemployment rate rising. We've got companies complaining that their customers have no money, and it's not just one or two. We've got it all over the world, but there is no recession. The guy presided over the worst thing since the Great Depression, and they give him a Nobel Prize. It's like,
sometimes,
what?
Jeff, it's better be lucky than anything else.
Yeah. And what they gave him the Nobel Prize for, though, is it was even more of a middle finger. Like, we'll give him a Nobel Prize because he, after it was over, explained why he thought it happened.